Hello and welcome to the Priggya Arora Show, where we discuss law, innovation, and entrepreneurship with people who have been there and done that. My name is Priggya Arora, founder of PA Legal, an intellectual property law firm in India. And today we have with us Mr. Stephen Carter, founder of the Intellectual Property Works. Welcome, Stephen, on the show.
Hi, Priya. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to it.
Perfect. And we'll mostly be discussing about IP plans, but let's begin by your story and how did you become the person you are today?
Sure.
Mhm.
Where to start? So I guess So I'm a patent attorney by qualification. But
Yeah.
how did I get into that? And I suppose I've always been interested in how things work. I remember growing up. My grandfather was an engineer. Worked in the Admiralty in the UK. So he designed for example, he designed the steam catapult for firing aircraft off aircraft carriers. And I remember sitting on his knee as a kid, and him telling me the stories about the things he was working on and designing when he could. Some of it was secret, but and just talking generally about how things worked with him, and used to go down into his workshop with him and make things. And similarly with my dad, we had a string of Volkswagen Beetles,
Wow.
and used to work with him, help him work on those, taking engines apart and putting them back together. So I guess that's where my kind of interest and love of understanding how things work and engineering came from. So I guess it wasn't that surprising that I ended up going to the University of Bath, did an engineering degree, and I stayed on and did a master's there that was still engineering, but it was more software focused. This is all a very long time ago, but and then I guess I got to the end of my master's and was trying to work out what I wanted to do. And I had quite a lot of friends that had gone on to become engineers, and I realized that they'd very quickly become project managers rather than people that were hands-on with the engineering.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm not sure I really want to be a project manager. What else can I do? And I actually went to the university careers office, and sat in front of it was an old sort of green screen computer, answered some questions on a bit of software they had then, and it printed out on one of those old dot matrix printers, printed out a list of possible careers that I might be interested in. And I think patent attorney was about fifth on the list. It caught my imagination, and applied to a few firms, and thankfully got accepted by one. And nearly 27 years later, still doing it. So I think it was the right choice.
Oh my God, what was that test? If you can name for all of us, we'll be happy to just rely on the test, except figuring it out.
Yeah, it's fun. I think number one on the list was tax advisor. So I'm not, I don't think it necessarily always suggests the right thing,
Yeah.
but yeah. And then so I worked most of my career in sort of traditional private practice, patent attorney firms. Spend a little bit of time in a general practice law firm, in their IP team. So which actually was it was good experience. I learned more about litigation and about the corporate world and corporate transactions and IP support in those. And then 4.5 years ago now, I decided that it was time for a change, and retired, in inverted commas, from the partnership I was in, and set up my own IP consultancy business. So still doing some what I call proper patent attorney work, but also now doing a lot more consultancy with startups and small businesses, helping them with IP planning, which we're going to be talking about today.
So, Stephen, my next question was this only because IP has so many aspects associated with it. We have patents, trademarks, copyright, and so on. Then in patents also we have drafting, we have patent searching, we have valuation, commercialization. How did IP planning or creating IP plans came into picture, and how did you actually start with IP plans?
It's a good question, actually. And I suppose, probably without really realizing that's what I was getting into, I've been doing it for quite a number of years. Um, and I think it grew out of, working with, so I used, when I was in the IP law firms, I used to work with quite a broad range of clients, right? From big, multinational businesses through to the small startups and everything in between. And I guess what became apparent is that particularly towards the smaller end of those types of clients, but actually also, some of the very big clients, you'd see the same mistakes that people were making over and over again. Yeah, and sometimes the same business making the same mistakes, but certainly the same mistakes made by lots of different small businesses. And when you start to think, well, why is that? What's going on? It becomes apparent very quickly that it's because they're not planning their approach to intellectual property. Their approach is very reactive rather than proactive.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, there must be, there's got to be a better way. I mean, and people are very familiar with the idea of having, business plans. No startup business starts. Well, hopefully, no startup business starts without a business. But very few take the same approach when it comes to intellectual property. And actually, I mean, an IP plan on its own is also no good. It has to be integrated with the business plan. So I mean, really, what I tend to be talking to businesses about is not the IP plan in isolation, but actually the fact that intellectual property should be one of the important elements of their overall business plan. And hopefully by having that plan, you at least make fewer mistakes when it comes to IP.
So, Stephen, you just spoke about mistakes, and you mentioned that especially smaller businesses, when they are starting up, they make some kind of mistakes. So, can you tell us, like, what are most common mistakes that you have seen in your career by probably MSMEs and entrepreneurs?
Yeah. How long do we have? It's no, I mean, so I guess there's mistakes that happen all over the place. I think a good place to start, and where I see a lot of mistakes, is around IP ownership.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking to businesses, whether that's when they're engaged as a client, or I do some training activities as well. I tend to talk a lot about IP ownership, as well as freedom to operate, which we can talk about a bit in a minute, and also the protection side of things.
Correct.
And I think particularly small businesses, when someone talks to them or mentions intellectual property, they tend to immediately think patents.
Yeah.
And then they tend to focus very much on the protection side of things, which I see very much as sort of the icing on the cake, and they miss out on the foundational stuff. And ownership is one of those really important foundation blocks, because obviously if you don't own the intellectual property assets that you're developing, that the value of your business is going to be based on, then you're in trouble. And IP ownership is also one of those things that the problems they're not necessarily very obvious, and they tend to only be spotted when someone starts to forensically analyze your business. For example, when you come to raise money and you go through a due diligence process, or you're looking to sell your business and you go through a due diligence process. So I think of these ownership problems almost like a ticking time bomb. So they're there under the surface, and no one sees them and no one knows them, and then all of a sudden you get into a due diligence and they explode in your face and cause lots of problems. But I mean, getting into some of the nitty gritty there, what are the ownership problems that I see all of the time? And I think the biggest one, particularly for small businesses, where when you're starting out in business, you tend to be reliant on other people. So you're collaborating with product designers or brand designers or software developers. And they're not employed by your business, but you're contracting with them to help you build the product that you're going to sell. So I do quite a lot of work in the software space, particularly recently quite a lot in digital health. So people that are developing apps for the medical technology space and other forms of medical technology, and they're obviously often the startups and the small businesses in that space are using contractors to do the software. And there's an assumption, which seems entirely reasonable, that if you're paying someone to write code for you, or you're paying someone to do a product design for you, then you'll own the intellectual property that's being created as part of that project. But as I'm sure you know, and others will know, that's not the case. That's not the way intellectual property law works, and certainly not the way copyright law works, which is one of the more important rights for software. And unless you have a contract in place that says that the copyright will transfer from the person writing the software to the business that's being built, then the copyright will sit with the software developer. And I've come across quite a lot of cases where that's just not been picked up in those early days. So that's one example of a common problem. Another simple one, and one that's often relatively easy to put right around ownership, is also where the innovation and the development of the product has started before the business has been incorporated.
Yes.
So it's quite common for startups. You have a couple of people come together, they have a great idea, they start working on the project, and then they get to a point where they think, actually, we think there's business in this. So they then incorporate the business, and what they forget to do is to assign their rights in that initial development work into the business. And again, you think that would be easy to sort out, and often it is. Simple assignment once it's uncovered. But there can be difficulties where, let's say the two partners that started the business have fallen out before that problem is spotted. That could cause problems down the line. And then there's also the potential for tax implications. Now, I'm not a tax expert, despite it being number one on the list when I did that thing at the university all those years ago. But so if you've built up a lot of value in that intellectual property, and then you transfer it from you as an individual into your business, then there can be tax implications there, because you're transferring something that has value. So things that are relatively simple to sort out in the early days, if as a small business you're aware that you need to be thinking about these ownership issues, you can make sure you have the right clauses in your contract with the software developer, for example. You can make sure that you do that assignment of your own IP rights into the business as soon as the business is incorporated.
So Stephen, just adding to the ownership issue we face mostly. So I'll just share one small story which I encountered. So it is a big business in India. Now it is a big business, but at the point they started very small. So they were, I think, 4 brothers, and each trademark is registered in each brother's name. So 4 trademarks, or many trademarks, but under different people's name, and they were the owners of the trademark, but they never assigned the right to the company. And during the litigation or the opposition, whatever we faced at that time, it was so difficult to prove that, okay, this is a big business and all these trademarks belong to this business, because they were never assigned.
And it's a classic example, and it's one of those things that, as you say, that you don't think to look or check, and no one notices until it's a big problem.
Correct. And people, I think, as you were just mentioning, at initial point of time, nobody or very less number of people think about IP. But when they receive some kind of notice or any kind of notice, then they'll be like, oh my God, what did we do wrong here?
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of people's first experience of IP, a lot of small businesses' experience, is when they're on the receiving end. So it's a bad experience, which I think just almost turns them off IP, and they think, oh, IP is a terrible thing, because in my experience is people trying to hit me with their big IP stick, But actually, they don't recognize that it has so much value in their own business that they really need to be thinking about it from early days. So I could go on talking about problems for a long time. I mean, another one, it sort of follows on a little bit, I think, from your trademark example there. There's a lot of in the trademark space, I find there's a lot of small businesses that assume their brand, their company name is protected if, so long as they've registered their company name and they've got some of the domain names.
Correct.
And then they see someone else comes on the market with entirely different company name. We all know that the company names don't have to be very much different to be able to get onto the register. And domain names, you can just have an extra hyphen in or something and get it, and then they get annoyed because someone's using a very similar brand and causing confusion in the marketplace, and they haven't appreciated until that point that actually registered trademarks are the on the grand scheme of things relatively inexpensive form of sound protection that you can use to protect your brand. So again, it's just this kind of confusion and lack of understanding.
Correct. So Stephen, as we just discussed the issues like ownership or considering company name as a trademark and things like that, when do you think is the right time for a company to start developing IP plans so that they can avoid these kinds of problems?
So it's another good question, and I think to me the answer is obvious, which is as soon as you're starting your company, IP ought to be one of those things that's on your radar. Unfortunately, I think this is one of the other misconceptions. There's if you ask a lot of small businesses that, they'll say, oh well, that's something that the big boys deal with. The big companies need IP strategies, IP plans, but actually we don't. You can just something we know it's important, but we're too busy doing other things, and we haven't got any budget anyway, and we'll worry about that down the line. But I think there's a lot that, with the right mindset and with a little bit of understanding, there's a lot that startups and small businesses can do without, with very little or no budget. Because if they're employing, going back to the example I gave before, if they're engaging with a product designer to design a product for them, then they're negotiating that contract anyway, or they may be just accepting the standard terms and conditions of the product designer or the software developer. But if they have in their mind, and if they understand that ownership of IP is important, they can at least check those standard terms and conditions. Because very often you're using a reputable product designer, their standard terms and conditions will say something along the lines of, so long as you pay me the money you owe me for the work, then the intellectual property rights will be transferred to you. And it's just some of those really quite easy, straightforward things to do and to spot early on can just be part of the plan. And having a plan in those early days might be something as simple as just a checklist of these are the things you ought to be thinking about whenever you're entering into a new business relationship with someone, or these are the things you ought to be thinking about when you're developing a product. And simple things like rules around, well, let's keep everything secret until we make a decision about whether we're going to protect it with a patent or not. So a little bit of education from the outset, and some very simple, straightforward rules or planning, I think can lay those foundations and make it much less likely that businesses are going to run into these bigger problems as they grow.
Stephen, like you just told us about hiring an independent contractor for the work or hiring any person for the work. In that agreements also, I think it's very important to mention who will be the owner of IP, who and what are the terms and conditions by which the person who is going to develop something or has any business relationship with the company, what are the terms and conditions for that? Can you share some of the IP clauses which could be present in those agreements, like the employment agreements or the service level agreements with the independent contractors?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, the detail of those clauses often can be fairly standard. But I think you also have to be a little bit careful about just pulling a template out of the tool bag, as it were. And I'm a big believer when it comes to entering into agreements like that you ought to start not with the detail of the agreement and not with what the specific clauses are going to be, but have a step back and say, well, what's the purpose of this agreement, and what's the work or the project that's going to be going on underneath it. So if you're engaging someone who's going to be working with you to develop a product, then quite clearly there's going to be some intellectual property rights or intellectual property assets being created. And so you have to have a conversation, or have to understand where the ownership of those assets is going to lie. And it might not always be right, or it might not always be the case that your business is able to take ownership, because it might be that the person you're working with is working with other clients as well, and this is sort of a platform technology that they need to be able to use with multiple clients.
Yes.
But then it's also thinking about what is it that I as a business need to be able to do with those IP assets to grow my business in the way I want to grow it. And so if you can't own the rights, you still need to be having a conversation and thinking about, well, what freedom do I need to be able to use those rights, and make sure that that's covered by the agreement. So it might be that, rather than having transfer of the assets and ownership by your business, it might be that you have a royalty-free license, or a royalty-paying license. And again, thinking commercially about it, what's in it for me, what's in it for them, and making sure that ideally it's a win-win situation. So it might be that there's a transfer of ownership, but there's still a license back, and there's some kind of revenue sharing agreement. So there's lots of the nitty-gritty of the legal words is something that can always be put in place. But the more important thing is getting that understanding between the parties as to what is it you're actually trying to achieve, what are you collaborating on, what do you both want to be able to do going forwards, and make sure that there's agreement on that first. And then the lawyers can do the paperwork in the background that makes that work.
I think you described it beautifully, that there has to be a win-win situation for both the parties, and parties should first sit and negotiate what would be the terms, and then they should tell the lawyers, okay, these would be our terms, based on this now you draft the contract, so that both parties are at a win-win situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Definitely.
So Stephen, another question is, like, many companies would come at an initial stage because you work in the domain of IP plan. So I'm sure you must have also seen this situation, that many people would come to you, but because they are startups or have limited funding, they'll say, we don't have IP budget, we can't do IP work. But I think there are small aspects, for example, trademark registrations or trade secret protections, which are not too costly, copyright protection, which are not too costly. And then there is other side of IP, which is costly. So what do you think, like, how they should prioritize the stuff, or should they start protecting stuff, or at how do they balance the IP budget and the IP protection?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's always tricky, as a startup business, or any business, I guess. They'll always have 101 things that they could be spending their money on, and they haven't got enough money to do all of those things. So it is about prioritization. And I think I see a lot of cases. One of the mistakes that I didn't mention. I mean, there's lots I didn't mention, but one of the ones is actually a lot of small businesses who waste money on IP protection.
Yes.
Because it's not always, it's not always the right thing to spend money on
Yes.
patents, certainly in the early days. It's patents can be, but as you know, patents can be a big money pit.
Yeah.
So you have to have the commercial justification to spend that money.
Yeah.
And particularly for the smaller businesses that are very budget constrained, if it's realistic to keep their innovation secret, then looking after it properly as a trade secret, at least maybe until the point where you've got the budget to go down the patent route, or it may be that the patent route is never relevant. I mean, people always cite the classic examples of the Coca-Cola recipe or the Colonel Sanders KFC spice recipe for his chicken as really good examples
Yeah,
of trade secrets. But
absolutely.
but trade secrets aren't all that valuable or that powerful. But trade secrets can still be a very powerful way of keeping that value within your business.
Correct.
But you need to recognize that's what you're doing and make sure that your employees know and the people working with you know that that's what you're doing, so they don't inadvertently let the information slip out. So it's not sure it's a really good answer to your question, because I think the point is that each business is different, and it's a case of helping them understand how important IP is or isn't to their plans for the business.
Yeah.
And then allowing, by doing that and letting them understand the options for protection based on what their strategy is and what their product strategy is. Because if they're about to launch products and it's going to be in the market soon, then trade secrets aren't an option. And if their product is easy to reverse engineer, but it's going to be a product that's going to be around for some time, then quite possibly investment in patent protection is going to be worthwhile.
Correct.
But it's always about making the IP plan and making your approach to IP protection match whatever those business aims are, and within the available budget. But I guess it's about helping them prioritize their budget. And I've seen too many businesses that have, maybe not directly as a result, but certainly spending lots of money on patent protection and not having the budget for marketing and product development and those other arguably more fundamental things, has meant that the business has ultimately failed. And at the end of the day, if there's no market for your product, or if you're not able to take the product to a point where you can put it on the market, then having a portfolio of patent applications is not often going to do you very much good. There's the rare cases where there's value in that IP in itself, and you might be able to sell or license the portfolio. But in most cases, this expensive patent portfolio just becomes a useless asset, and you've wasted that money.
Yeah, Stephen, very well said. The way you explained that many businesses, there are a part of businesses who will come to you and argue that they do not have much of IP budget, but there is other side also where people waste money on IP protection because probably that protection is not good for the business, or for example, they are filing a patent application which is of no use. There are a lot of businesses which do make that practice, but if they're not earning money to from whatever they are filing, I think that is not a good idea in the initial phases. If you have a lot of IP budget, still it's okay, but in the initial phases, you should protect IP which is going to reap you benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sadly, I think sometimes it's driven by external forces.
Yeah.
So I work with a lot of businesses I'm working with are working towards raising money. They're looking for investment. And most growing businesses are on that pathway, aren't they, where they're kind of looking for one round of investment and another round after. And so they're obviously listening to what the investors say they want, and a lot of investors, and it's getting better, I think, but a lot of investors will bang that patent drum because they think, right, patents are the way forward, and when the business doesn't have patents, then it's not protected. But particularly in some of the software space that I work in, It's you can get patents for software. Some people are under the misconception you can't, but it has to be the right sort of software and has to be doing the right sort of thing. So there are a lot of cases where patent protection is not going to be available for the app that the business is developing or the other software the business is developing. But as you know, when you file a patent application, ultimately that means that all of that quite detailed information about what you're doing gets published.
Yes.
And so you can end up in the worst of both worlds. You've spent money on a patent application that's probably never going to get granted, and you've told the world what you're doing, so you've made it impossible to retain anything as a trade secret. So I think sometimes my role is to be working with those small businesses to help them frame the story, the IP story for the investors.
Yes.
So when an investor says, where are your patents, rather than go, well, we haven't filed any yet, but we can file, we're planning to, they can say, well, actually, we've taken advice on this, and patents aren't appropriate for our product.
Wow.
And it's much better that we keep things as a trade secret, and for all these reasons. And so they've got that convincing position that they can set out to potential investors and demonstrate that even though they haven't got patents, they are looking after and protecting the value in their intellectual property.
Yeah, wow. Stephen, you just opened my eyes. Like, instead of filing a patent application, they can also take a route by explaining their story, why they're not considering patent in this area. Because there are, you and I work in the similar domain, so we also know how many bogus patent applications are filed, which are not going to be of any use to anyone. So, yeah, but it is a practice which is going on in the industry. Though we try to avoid it, people like you and me would like to give the right answer and right approach to the clients. But clients sometimes are like, oh, our friend has done it, so we'll also do it. So, yeah, things like that. But it is a right approach. Like, if you don't foresee any commercial benefits on your technology, it's good to keep it as a trade secret. Even if there is a commercial benefit, we'll have to weigh whether it's actually patentable or not. If it is actually patentable, we should go ahead and file it. But if it is not, then we might consider another IP strategy for it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's exactly the way to approach it. It's, recognize that you are creating these IP assets, and that they have value to your business, and then come up with a proper plan as to what in all of this, taking all of the circumstances into account, and in particular, like in the context of your particular business plan, what is the most appropriate way of protecting those IP assets, if they can be protected. There'll be some cases where it's just not possible, and you have to think about, look at other ways of ensuring that you succeed in the marketplace by, being first or quickest, or having the better brand, or
yeah. So, Stephen, now we'll come to your story, and it is a quick rapid fire round so that audience come to know who you are as a person. So, answer these questions very quickly. 3 things that you are grateful for.
Grateful for, what would I say? My family, my health. Third thing, and I guess just how do I describe it? My network. I mean, all the amazing, contacts I have, both in work and social life, and just they value those relationships, definitely.
Awesome. 2 traits or habits that you think are useful for a professional career.
I think, what's the first one? Maybe like a willingness to learn.
Yeah.
I think, I'm certainly still learning things every day, particularly, about technology and about the law and about, the approach to it. It's definitely willingness to learn. What's another one? I guess another one that I think is really important in this space is being prepared to ask those difficult questions.
Yeah.
I think you have to be able to challenge the people you're working with, and the clients, and not just be a kind of yes man, because they have misconceptions about how they should do things. I'm not saying I'm always right either, but
yes,
yeah, you've got to be prepared to push people and make sure that you're really getting the proper answers from them.
Awesome. And one aspiration you have for the future?
Gosh, that's a tricky one. I think, well, the easy one is for my children to grow up happy and healthy.
Wow.
So that's probably the best one. I mean, from a business point of view, I guess I just aspire to be able to engage with more and more startups and small businesses, and spread the word about IP and how important it is to their business, and how they can do some simple things at the outset and set themselves up for success.
Awesome. And I am with you on this. Let's do this together and spread IP awareness throughout the world. So, Stephen, any final thoughts before we conclude this podcast?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's been a great conversation. And as you know, I always love the opportunity to spread the IP word, and I think you're doing a great job of that on this podcast. So no, thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was wonderful having you on the show, and I look forward to meeting you again. Take care.
Likewise. Bye.
Hey there, thank you for attending today's session. If you enjoyed today's session, do follow our channel and consider sharing it with a friend. My name is Priggya Arora, daughter of inspiring parents, alumna of IIT Kharagpur, engineer turned lawyer and entrepreneur, and now founder of PA Legal, where we help creators and innovators protect their intellectual property. Thank you.